I won't give a proper welcome until after lunch, when we launch the summer school properly. But my name is Dave Spooner, and I'm with the GLI, and sort of with Dan, sitting there, hands up. I'm responsible for the programme this week. This is what we call the preschool introductory meeting. We call it the International Summer School Starter Kit. Before I start, Khalid, would you stand? Khalid is standing there with his camera, and he is, along with another comrade of ours called Chris, who's coming this afternoon. He will be taking photographs of the summer school as we go through. If for any reason you do not want your photograph taken or used or published or put on the net or anything, then just tell Khalid, please avoid taking my picture. And I'm sure he will oblige. Thanks, Khalid. Okay, this session is designed to be primarily for people who maybe have never been to an international trade union meeting before, or maybe feel new to the international trade union movement. So it's an attempt to give a bit of a rough guide to the movement itself. The school is called The Politics of the International Trade Union Movement, what it is and what it should be. So before we start to talk about those politics in more detail, it's a good idea to maybe for us all to know what we're talking about when we talk about the international trade union movement. So that's what I'm going to be doing. Stop me at any time. Interrupt, I don't mind, I'm not proud. If you don't understand something that I'm saying, then just shout, right, and I'll explain. Especially if I begin to use abbreviations that you've never heard of, you don't know what they stand for, stop me and I shall tell you. But hopefully I shall remember to spell things out in detail. Anything else I need to say before I start? No, I don't think so. Okay. All right. So, the International Summer School Starter Kit. We're going to be talking largely about what are often called global unions. And I have put global unions in inverted commas because there are no such things really as real global unions. Unions which we're all part of in terms of paying our fees to directly, that we elect directly to a union we're a member of. There are a few little attempts at forming a real global union. For example, my own union, Unite, has an agreement with the Canadian union, the steelworkers, and they try and form a one union together. Although whether or not that's going to really happen is another question altogether. But what we're really talking about are two different sets of organisations. One is the Global Union Federations, and the other is the International Trade Union Confederation. And I'm going to be talking about both. So the Global Union Federations are generally known by the very unattractive abbreviation of being a GUF, a Global Union Federation, a GUF, right? And the International Trade Union Confederation is the ITUC. Okay, so you'll hear those words a lot during the week. So first of all, what are these global union federations? You are probably, through the union that you are members of, you are probably a member of a global union federation. These are based on the industry that you're part of. So a little bit of the money that you pay your union in terms of union dues goes to, each year, a global union federation. And in crude terms, I'm told by my friends in the global union federations that it works out like the cost of a cup of coffee or even a small beer every year, right? That's the extent to which you're paying in to a global union federation. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 major global union federations. We have the Building and Woodworkers International, which is basically the construction industry.
Excuse me,
Yes?
Can we get this on our email, or is it impossible? Because then we can focus on what you are telling us.
Very good point. This whole presentation will be available on the website afterwards, and I think it will be downloadable. Is that possible? Yes, so you'll be able to download it from your own computers, so you don't need to take detailed notes, you can just follow. I should have said that, thank you very much. Okay, so the Building and Woodworkers International, known as BWI, is primarily the the Global Union Federation of Construction Workers. Then you have Education International, which is probably the largest of the Global Union Federations, which is all the people in the education industry. Then you have one called Industrial, which is a merger between several global unions, which took place in 2012, of the chemical, energy and mine workers, the metal and engineering, and textiles and garments. And they all came together to form what they call Industrial, right, which is a sort of private sector industrial union federation. Then we have the International Federation of Journalists, which is actually quite small, the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, the International Union of Food Workers. Now, I will give a prize of drinks of your choice all evening to anybody who can tell me the full name of the International Union of Food Workers, other than Dan. Anybody know? The IUF, the International Union of Food, does anybody know its full name? Bolton? Nearly. Dan, what is the full name?
It's the International Union of Food, Agriculture, Hotel, Restaurant,
Catering,
Tobacco,
Restaurant, Agriculture,
and Allied Workers.
Very good. Dan should know he was 26 years, is that right?
We once had it whittled down to International Food and Allied Workers.
Right.
But then the plantation workers, we worked with plantation workers, we insisted on having agriculture in it, so everybody else wanted the name back.
Dan, who you'll get to know during the week, was 26 years?
Yeah.
26 years of the General Secretary of the International Union of Food Workers. So he has encyclopedic knowledge of the international trade union movement. Okay, then we have Public Services International, which is all the public sector workers and public services, which I think many of you are coming from. And Union Network International, which is another long list of other sectors, but it's basically finance, banking, retail, IT, post and telecommunications, entertainment, yeah, any others? Yeah, anyway, so it's a long list of basically private sector services. That's what it's about. So you have private sector industry, which is Industrial, and private sector services, which is Union Network International.
Actually, it should be called Industry Sun because
Yeah.
the food industry is
Indeed. Okay, I'm just going to look in a little bit more detail at a few of these, and they are...
Dave,
Hello, sorry.
there's one missing.
What's that? Ah, the International Domestic Workers Federation.
Yes.
I do apologise. Myrtle, I do apologise. There is a new Global Union Federation since... I haven't updated this since the form. The International Domestic Workers Federation, of which Myrtle is the president. Yeah? And you'll be hearing a lot more from Myrtle later on in the week when she's going to be speaking. I do apologise. That's terrible omission.
IWF is part of IUF.
Sorry?
IWF is part of IUF.
Oh, that's right. It is.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. All right. It's not. Doesn't seem to be moving forwards. What is? What am I doing wrong? There we go. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to concentrate on a few of these. The reason I'm going to concentrate on these is that these are the global union federations that are supporting and participating in the summer school. Right? So most of you are part of one of these global unions. So this is the International Union of Food Workers, and here is the full name: International Union of Food, Agricultural, Hotel, Restaurant, Catering, Tobacco and Allied Workers Associations. The Allied Workers Associations means that you can basically bring in anybody else that you like. This was founded in 1920 and itself was a merger between other internationals that date back into the 19th century. There are something like 336 unions in 120 countries that are members of the IUF, and if you add them all together, you, in theory at least, means that the IUF represents 12 million workers, and it's based in Geneva in Switzerland. Okay? Then we have the International Transport Workers Federation. Unusually, this is based in London. It organises seafarers, dock workers, civil aviation workers, railways, road transport, urban transport, fisheries, tourism. And it has 681 unions affiliated to it, representing 4.5 million workers in 148 countries. The Building and Woodworkers International, BWI, again, is also based in Geneva. It organises in building materials, wood and forestry industries, with 350 unions representing 12 million members in 135 countries. And finally, PSI, which is a big one, based in Ferney in France, which is actually Geneva, really. It's just across the border from Geneva. The reason there is they're cheapskates, right? And it's cheaper to run an organisation in France than it is in Switzerland, so they just moved it across the border by a few yards. And we mean a few yards. It organises in social services, healthcare, municipal and community services, central government, and public utilities, such as water and electricity. It has 20 million workers, represented by 669 unions in 154 countries. Interesting thing about PSI, of course, is that its key issue, which it's been facing for so many, many years, of course, is privatisation. And what happens when, say, you're working for a local government in the water industry, and the water industry is privatised? Do you remain a public service worker, or do you actually become a private sector worker and you move into industrial? So there's a bit of a grey area there. What happens to public service workers when their work is privatised? Okay, so those are the four which I wanted to highlight. I don't want to give the impression that these are huge, great organisations. They're not. I mean, by comparison with our own unions, they're quite small. The IUF probably has, how many staff do you reckon, scattered around the world, Dan?
Oh, I don't know. Probably,
about 30? 20?
around there.
20 members of staff, something like that. And I'll come on to that in a moment, that's right. So if you include project workers and temporary workers and so on, no more than 20 people working for the IUF, as an example. PSI. Hazel, how many staff in PSI? 70 around the world, scattered around, yeah? That gives you a sense of the scale of the operation. In the IUF's case, the whole of the agricultural sector, for example, which is probably still today, employs more people in the world, if you include informal workers, than anybody else, is one person. sitting in Geneva who tries to organise agricultural workers. So these are not well-resourced organisations. We'll come on to that later. Okay, so that's your global union federations. And you are members of that. Your union, when every 4 years approximately, there will be a congress in each of the global union federations. And your union will send a delegation, anything from 1 to 20 or whatever, people who go and attend that with a vote representing you. And they elect an executive committee, they elect a general secretary and president, they determine policy, and they set out the priorities for the coming 4-year period. These are quite big events and quite expensive events, you can imagine, because they have to be in at least 10 different languages, so you have simultaneous interpretation into all the languages. You have maybe in big global union federations like the ITF, you may have thousands of people who attend these congresses. And some of them are really exciting, they're very interesting. And you should try and get yourself elected by your union to attend these global union conferences, because that's where really the heart of the politics of the international trade union movement is debated. Okay, so that's the global union federations. What do they do? Well, these days they are primarily there to support international organising, particularly within transnational corporations. So you can, it used to be, in my opinion, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the global union federations, which were called in those days something else, they were called international trade secretariats. And by the name of it, secretariat, you can get an understanding of what it does. It really acted as like a switchboard, so that how do people contact one another from one country to another, and so on and so forth. But because of globalization, and because of the growth of the power of transnational corporations, they've had to become more than switchboards. They've had to become real organisers at an international level. So if you work for a transnational corporation, it becomes extremely important that you are working with your comrades and colleagues in other countries working in the same company. Otherwise, they divide and rule. Right? They will tell you one thing and tell other countries another thing. You've got to be coordinated. So that's why the key issue for global union federations is coordination within transnational corporations. That's a very expensive thing to do. If you have to fly people together from within a particular company, right, it takes thousands of pounds. You have hotels and flights and so on. So there's a real struggle about how do you, on very small budgets, manage to set up genuine trade union networks within transnational corporations. We'll talk about that later. They coordinate solidarity actions. So if a union, for example, is having a major dispute in their country, and they call for international solidarity, right, it will be done through the Global Union Federation. And one of the things at the end of this week, you'll hear several times, one of the key things you have to do is, first of all, work out what global federation you are members of through your union, and make sure you're on their mailing list. Right? Make sure that you get almost daily news from the global unions about what's happening in other parts of the world, and when you are receiving requests for solidarity, and it could be simply sending a message of support to somebody in another country, which is very, very important, very simple but very important, then it's a good idea to respond immediately. We'll be talking about that sort of thing a lot. They also do trade union development work and education work. This means that some countries, you have unions which may be very weak, maybe they're very new, maybe they're trying to operate as a union in an extremely hostile environment, places like Russia, or places like China, or places like any number of countries that we know where it's tough for unions. Then they get support in how to develop and to grow their own union. And a lot of that is done through education work and in training. To give you an example of that, GLI here in Manchester, in the UK, we work very closely with the International Transport Workers Federation in a project to support the development of unions in the informal transport sector. So people who are driving jeepneys in the Philippines or tuk-tuks in India or whatever. How do we organise those? So there's a big education programme providing seminars and workshops and training events for union leaders about how can you organise informal transport workers. This is the sort of thing that global union federations do all the time. So big projects to help their affiliates. They also represent our interests in that sector, in that industry, to a whole number of United Nations related organisations. So in the transport industry you'll find that there are international federations of employers in the transport sector, of governments who are working around transport and so on. And we have to make sure that there's union representation there. And amongst employers' associations as well, internationally. They run campaigns. For example, PSI, of course, will be running campaigns on obvious things like save our public services. The ITF will be running campaigns against about fatigue amongst lorry drivers. The food workers would might run campaigns against what's it called? GM foods, for example. They do research about their industry and what's happening, and they often get consultants to come in and do pieces of research to understand what's happening in their industry, and generally they help the exchange of information from one union to another in different parts of the world. Okay, that was the global union federations. Now we move on to this thing called the International Trade Union Confederation, and this is, excuse me, sip of coffee. This is the federation at an international level of national trade union centres. So, here in Britain, I'm a member of Unite, the union, which is part of the Trade Union Congress in the UK. So the Trade Union Congress meets its equivalents in other parts of the world. So if you're in Spain, it might be Comisiones Obreras or UGT. It might, if you're in Norway, it will be the LO Norway. If you're in Sweden, it'll be the LO in Sweden. If you're in, I don't know, who else have we got here? In Pakistan, it will be the Pakistan Workers' Federation. So these are what are called national trade union centres. In other words, the national federations, and they have their own confederation called the ITUC. This was formed relatively recently, actually, in 2006, as a merger between two other former confederations of national trade union centres, and I'll explain that in a moment. They're based in Brussels, and they are the global TUC, Trade Union Congress, of trade union congresses around the world. It came from a merger of two former federations. One was called the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. Note the word free. Anybody know why the word free is in there? Any guesses? Freedom from? Independent from? No, unfortunately that's not true. No, it means free as opposed to the communist trade unions. Right? And we'll come on to that again in a second. So this originally dates back to 1949, and the date is significant. And it was basically the social democratic or democratic socialist or other sort of progressive but non-communist unions around the world who were part of the ICFTU. Same time, there was a much smaller organisation called the World Confederation of Labour, which was formed in 1920, and that was a Christian predominantly. It described itself towards the end as a confederation of faith, but in fact, it was Christian. And in fact, it was the Catholic Church. And I'm told, I don't know if it's true, other people will know, that when it used to meet in its own congress, it would be a democratic process and so on and so forth, but you'd always have a Jesuit priest sitting at the end of the table who, just to make sure that everything was okay. So it was very much dominated by the Catholic Church. Most of us, the countries that we're in, we wouldn't know very much about the WCL, World Federation of Labour. But if you're in places like the Philippines or Latin America or Poland or elsewhere where there is a very strong Catholic tradition, you would find a World Confederation of Labour. Or, in many other parts of the world, union federations that weren't, for whatever reason, members of the ICFDU, didn't want to join the communists, right, and ended up in the WCL. So, these two merged in 2006 to form the ITUC. Okay, what's the ITUC for? A lot of people ask this question. But basically, it represents trade union interests at the international governmental level, primarily, particularly at the International Labour Organization, which I'm going to come on to. So, in the same way as we have national trade union centres in each of our countries that represents our interests to our governments, that's the primary purpose of those, the ITUC represents the trade union interest to the global governmental organisations, like the World Bank and the IMF and the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, and so on and so forth. That's the core role of the ITUC, so that top level representing trade union interests. It campaigns for workers' rights in general, right, across the board. It coordinates solidarity actions against trade union repression. So if you have a country what's a good current example? Who's the ITUC campaigning around these days? Qatar, good one, right. Qatar in the Arab states, which has got horrific labour rights and labour conditions, lack of labour rights and terrible labour conditions. They organise on behalf of everybody, because it's not just one sector, it's not just one industry that's affected, it's everybody. So it's the ITUC takes the lead in campaigning like that. They also do research and union development work, and they are overwhelmingly run and geared up to the concept of decent work, which we'll talk about during the week. But in brief, decent work is the idea of having rights, having pensions, having access to health care, getting decent wages, having health and safety at work. In other words, what we all want, what we're fighting for, and they tend to be packaged together and called decent work. Now, there is another federation. So alongside the ITUC, well, not hardly alongside, but there you go, is the World Federation of Trade Unions. And this is dominated by communist parties around the world. It was formed in 1945. It was used to be based in Prague, and it was absolutely linked to the Soviet state system, right, and funded basically by Soviet states. And its roots go right back to the Profintern in 1922 and beyond there. Right? So it's very much out of that Bolshevik, Leninist party model, and the World Federation of Trade Unions was set up along that model. And those of you who've read anything of the political history, that unions in this context are seen as transmission belts for party lines. So the party comes first, the party tells the unions basically what policies they need to adopt and what strategies they're going to have. And so these are unions which are dominated by communist parties. It's currently based in Athens, which has one of Europe's larger communist party-dominated trade union federations. It nearly collapsed. We'll come on to that in a second. Obviously, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and all the former Soviet states, the floor underneath the WFDU just fell away because there's no longer those big state parties. However, it has just about, in a strange way, survived, and it does continue today. There is a question.
So, may I
Yes.
just ask, I'm not really familiar with this federation. How does it? Why is it being tacked on at the end, and rather than like with the other federations? Is it because it's not as powerful or as impactful
It's
or relevant?
it's a good question. It's because its relevance to us, not just us in this room, but the trade union movement throughout the world, is very limited. I mean, in terms of what it actually is able to do, for example, coordinating in transnational corporations or representing democratically the interests of the workers, it's very, very, very insignificant compared to the ITUC. But it still has ideological significance. Yeah, in that sense, it carries that banner of pretty well unreformed Communist Party ideology. There are some people who are arguing that there are signs of a resurgence of this. Why? Because since the merger between ICFTU and the WCL, creating the International Trade Union Confederation in 2006, there's been a marked decline, collapse. But then the Greek unions grabbed it and re-established it, and there's been signs of a few more unions beginning to join. But mostly it is countries like Vietnam, Cuba, other sort of communist states that are supporting the WFTU.
So can I ask?
I want to hear it.
Dan.
The footnote on the WFTU in the Greek crisis. The WFTU and the Greek organization that supports it, opposes it, have taken the position of neither for the government nor for the European and international institutions, and they have recommended a blank vote. Attractive but they might have passed with
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes.
I just wanted to ask. So has the RMT, for example, joined the WFTU instead of the ITUC, or is it that's? And I know it'll feed into the conversation later on about politics and trade unions. But is that what is?
It's a very good question. We don't know. In fact, I hope the RMT guys here. Where are they? Where are you? Where's the RMT? Oh yeah. I don't know. Do you know? Do you know whether you formally joined the WFTU? No. Right. Okay. Neither do I, and neither do most RMT people I talk to. But if the RMT was able to affiliate directly to the WFTU, that would conflict with the fact that the RMT is a member of the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, which is affiliated to the International Trade Union Confederation. So you have a conflict of interest there. Yes, Baba.
Yeah, I think like with NEHAU and also with about 9 different unions now in Nigeria, what you have is they are affiliated to the TUIs, Trade Union Internationals, that are the WFTU, what the GOVs are to the ITUC. And something, well, it might seem a bit of a pipe dream, but those of us in Nigeria and some unions in South Africa like NEHAU, like also SAMU, is that, I mean, if you could have a ICFTU and a WCL uniting to form an ITUC, if there are voices within the WFTU and that are active, our unions, CUSATU, NLC, also play active roles in the ITUC and will play active roles in our GOVs. That the whole essence of things is the more united the working class is stronger.
Yeah. Okay.
I
Asaf.
will be here.
Oh, Asaf.
I want to just mention that historically speaking, it's important to put it in perspective, although communist parties have become really something of very dogmatic phenomenon. The WFTU was formed as a united organization of all unions in 1945 after the war. It was a federation of the coalition against the Nazis. And the Americans refused to join. The Americans just blew it from within, and so this kind of factional heat between the social democratic and the communist so detrimental to the trade union and to world peace and progress, I think it is something that we carry from 48. So, but still, for the historical truth should be mentioned.
Okay, there are different versions of that story, and we are not going to go to that now. But it is a very interesting history, right? I mean, and actually it traces back before the Cold War, before the Second World War. It goes right back to the origins of the attempt by the Communist Party-based unions to impose Communist Party policy on the independent trade union movement. But it's a complex story. We'll come back to in the bar on that one, Asaf. Okay.
So,
sorry, yes.
I am to see it. We are belong to the Communist Party of Nepal.
You're right.
And we are affiliated with ITUC.
Yes.
But the same party, there are one trade union called CONEP, Confederation of Professionals.
Yes.
And they are related with WFTU.
Yes.
And they have a good number. I think they are covering civil servants. And they have more than 200,000 members.
All right.
Yeah, they are affiliated with WFTU. So, same Communist Party.
Yeah.
One is affiliated with ITUC and one is WFTU.
Now, very complicated. Okay. Okay. All of these organisations, both the Global Union Federations and the ITUC, have regional structures. So, and it varies between one international organisation and another. Some are highly regionalised, where, for example, there are direct elections of regional secretaries, regional presidents, regional executive committees, and so on. Others are more centrally controlled. But you are, so in terms of meetings that you may well attend, right, as activists in the trade union movement internationally, you may well be attending global events like a congress, but it's more likely that you'll be attending regional meetings of your organisation because, for example, most of the education work and the development work is done at a regional level rather than at a global level. So you just need to be aware of the fact that there are regional structures in these organisations. Okay, I want to say a little bit about the International Labour Organisation, the ILO. It is not a trade union organisation. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the ILO is a trade union body. It is not. It is actually what's called a tripartite body, which means it's made up of 3 constituents. And this is a photograph. I don't know if you can see it. Maybe you switch the light off next to the, if you wouldn't mind. That's better. Okay. Here's a photograph of the annual International Labour Conference, which is the main decision-making body of the International Labour Organization. And it lasts for 2 weeks every year in June in Geneva. What fun it is. And you'll see here, this is the main ILC International Labour Conference session in process. And what you have here is down here on the left-hand side, these are all delegates from unions. These are trade union representatives. And on the other side, you have a whole block of employers' representatives.
Wow.
And come on to that. And in the middle, you have representatives of governments. So unions hold 25% of the votes, employers hold 25% of the votes, and governments, who pay for the whole thing, have 50% of the votes. Why? Okay. The first meeting of the ILO, the first International Labour Conference, was held in 1919. Anybody know why? Why do you think they held a first meeting of governments, unions, and employers in 1919? Deck.
Is it fear of being spread of the experience of the Russian Revolution?
Exactly. You had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, right? And, excuse my language, but it scared the shit out of governments and employers all over the world, right? So they recognized that they had to do something on an international level to improve the conditions of workers. Otherwise, they were all going to be attracted to Bolshevism, to the communist movement. Yes?
May I give the official reason?
No. No, go on. Karin, go on. What is the official reason?
The official reason is it was the end of World War II. And,
World War I.
Sorry, the end of World War I and the absolute disastrous conditions of working people, in particular in Europe. And then, of course, with respect of the Russian model, they urgently thought they had to do something in order to improve workers' lives so that they don't get the idea of taking over themselves. But it was the idea was we have to do something out of this disastrous situation of World War I.
Thank you very much. Karin knows a lot about the ILO, by the way. She's, Yes?
Also, it resulted out Convention number 1, 888, AAA Convention. So after this 1919, the first conference, so it declared the first convention.
Yeah, what was the first convention adopted? Anybody know?
It's about 888. 8 hours.
Oh, 8 hours a day. Sorry, thank you. Yes, right. So the very first thing. So what they do, every International Labour Conference, it's a very complex organisation, and I won't bore you with the detail. And it's a huge bureaucracy, lines behind it. But its core role is to adopt what they call conventions. Yeah. Right? And these are, they discuss, for example, the 8-hour day. That's the first thing they talked about. Now I understand. I didn't know that. That they thought the working hours ought to be limited, and they agreed. The employers, the governments, the workers all said, right, 8 hours, that's it. All right? Then, once they had agreed that, they then have to go back to their countries, and the governments then have to bring that into their own law. Right? It doesn't have any power unless the governments actually introduce it into their own law. The ILO has no army, it has no police force. So if it has, as it does, many, many different conventions covering many different topics about workers' rights, in effect, right? They mean nothing unless the governments actually introduce it into their own laws and then implement them. And there's countless numbers of governments who will sign up and say, oh yes, we agree with that, but then don't enact it, don't do anything to police it. So in many ways, it doesn't have any power, but it is symbolic power, at the very least, that it enables workers to have a voice in the United Nations system. It's part of the United Nations. Okay? In fact, the very first of the United Nations organisations. And it has what are called the core labour standards. Some years ago, they came together in the conference and said that they've got hundreds of different conventions. What they need to do is concentrate on a few absolutely essential conventions that all governments, irrespective of whether or not they have passed them into law, they need to respect. And that's effectively freedom of association. So you are free to join a union of your choice. Right? That is actually what that means. The right to collective bargaining. You have the right to bargain collectively with your employer. The elimination of forced labour. Nobody can be forced to work. The effective abolition of child labour. Notice the difference in wording here. The elimination of forced labour and the effective abolition of child labour. That's because they recognise how difficult it is to eradicate child labour because of many, many social and economic factors. And finally, freedom from any form of discrimination, whether it be gender or race or religion and so on and so forth. So these are the core things. These are the ones that really matter in terms of what the ILO stands for. And it's very important to us because when we're in countries like China, for example, where there is no freedom of association, we have to continually call Chinese government to account and say, you are not respecting a fundamental core labour standard, which is freedom of association. So don't get these confused with the union structures themselves, they're not, but they are important in the way in which the global trade union movement works. Dan?
Yeah, the risk, of course, when one does this, the Domestic Workers Convention and the Home Workers Convention, which were designed to protect informal workers, vulnerable informal workers, and who have somehow become valued through this focusing on core
Indeed.
labor standards.
Indeed. Okay.
So we have to make extra efforts to get those amplified and enforced.
Indeed. Okay, yeah.
Sorry, why isn't the right to strike part of the core labor standards?
Very good question. Karin.
No.
Dan.
There is no right to strike.
There is no right to strike.
Officially, there is a big dispute at the ILO at the moment with some sort of resolvement, but I personally have a different view to that, okay. But the jurisprudence of the ILO was for all the time that these conventions existed, in particular freedom of association, they said only if you can exercise your right to strike, then you really have freedom of association. In the text of the convention, there's no such thing as a right to strike. This is what the employers claim. So they refuse to tackle any violations against the right to strike in the ILO process for long years. It's a kind of core attack they have been doing towards the workers, and they came to a compromise now with the I2C, that is the secretariat of the ILO workers group, that they agreed that everybody has the right to industrial actions, which includes also the right to lock out. So, this is the compromise, but was never put forward like this from the I2C. They say it's a huge victory, that we still have the right to strike, and I didn't really follow very detailed the discussion at this year because it was directed to another committee, but actually the workers group did not really put forward these cases, but what it is now that it is slowly kind of getting off the agenda of the ILO, and which in effect, that's my personal point of view, is weakening the whole ILO, which is by nature already a kind of weak instrument for workers, but it is still weakening them by kind of restraining from the very beginning to put forward these violations against the right to strike.
Okay.
It's a very complicated story. It's been going on for years.
To answer it in a different way, this is almost, I think the ILO is best understood as institutionalized class struggle. Right? That's really what it is. Institutionalized class struggle going on. Actually what happens, in very crude ways, is that when they have these conferences, the workers group, right, which is basically coordinated by the ITUC, the workers group, the person sitting just there, who will be the spokesperson, will stand up and say, we want to have the right to strike, right? Or we want to have better wages, or we want to have whatever it might be, right? They put demands. And instantly, the employer's representative over here will stand up and oppose it, okay? And they will argue. And then individual governments will then stand up. And so, the government of America, the United States, will turn up and say, well, we agree with the workers on that, but the employers on that. And then the Russians will stand up and say, well, we totally agree with the employers. And then the British will stand up and say, we're British. And then the... and they will squabble amongst themselves, right? So you get some governments which are actually quite pro-worker, right? Pro-trade union. Not very many, but some. And of course you've got others which are very right-wing and will be supporting the employers on everything. So it's like this continual institution of class struggle that's going on all the time. And not just at the conferences, but it goes in the corridors of the bureaucracy itself. And if you ever go to Geneva, and I recommend you do, it's a very nice place. If you ever go to Geneva, go and visit the ILO. You can walk in, you have the right, you're workers, you're members of a union, it's your place as much as anybody else, right? Walk in and first of all, you'll notice that a lot of people are wearing very expensive clothes. That a lot of the cars in the car park underneath are very expensive, right? They're well paid, most of these people. And they're there, partly, at least, to answer to you. And it's important that you wander around the corridors and knock on doors and say, here, we're worried about this or that, and so on. Go and sit in the coffee bar and overhear conversations between people. It's very interesting. But it's all institutional class struggle. Okay, let's move on. Okay, I want you to imagine that you are attending your first ever international trade union meeting. And it could be within your global union federation. It could be a European meeting. It could be a global meeting. It could be an educational event. It could be a policy-making event. And you walk into the bar or the coffee area. And if you're listening to people who've been around the international trade union movement for a while, hearing their conversation, what are the things you hear them talk about? And these are, apart from the price of the coffee and how nice their suits are, these are some of the things that they talk about. First of all, what's happening to capitalism itself? Right? Post-banking crisis, we all know what's going on in Greece and so on and so forth, but primarily this idea of financialization of the global corporations. What does that mean? It basically means that the big global companies are becoming banks. They've got tons of money. Right? They're not worried about austerity. They are sitting on mountains of money. And what happens is, say a car company, right, has got a load of cash. Where does it invest it? Does it invest in making better cars, new cars, more environmentally good cars, and so on and so forth? No. It's likely to invest in, say, maybe a credit card program, right? It may be just simply invests in a company making bananas, ice cream, right? Whatever they think is going to make them the most money. And within that, you will have heard of things like hedge funds, you will have heard of private equity funds, and so on. And these are marauding new forms of capitalism, go around the world and basically buying up companies, selling companies for the short term. They're not interested in this furniture-making company because they're interested in furniture. They're interested in that furniture-making company because they think they can buy it now at that price and sell it at that price 2 years later. So basically, they're becoming financial assets. And that has an extraordinary effect on all of us. Now, you know, have you heard of the term, we'll come on to this a bit later, but things like zero-hour contracts, temporary work, outsourced work, agency labour, all of these precarious forms of workers, right? And all workers around the world are becoming more and more precarious because of the impact of financialisation of the corporations. If I'm sitting there and I buy the furniture factory, the last thing I want is to have responsibility for a full-time, properly resourced workforce. I don't want to have to pay pension contributions. I don't want to have to pay when they get sick. I don't want to have to look after them if they have children. I don't want to, and so on and so forth. What I want is a workforce that I can just instantly get rid of when I feel like it. And it doesn't appear on my accounts as a liability. Because if you have properly paid workers, right, you have responsibilities for them. And that is a financial liability. You don't want that. You want to take them out of that part of the accounts and put them into simply stuff that you can hire and fire at will through things like labour agencies. So there's a lot of discussion going on in the global unions and in the ITUC about how we deal with it, what is in effect a new form of capitalism. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this because it's quite complicated and very interesting stuff. But in your packs, you will find a document which is called Key Issues and Questions, which is actually written from our 2013 summer school. And that talks about new capitalism and financialisation. So if you're interested in that, follow that one up. It's just a couple of pages you can read. Okay. Next one is that we have a problem with Europe. Not quite the same level as the Greeks have a problem with Europe, but we have a problem with Europe as well. The European Union, at its heart, had this idea of social Europe, whereby unions and employers were regarded as what they call social partners, and they both treated with equal respect in terms of working with the European Union, with the European Commission, the formulation of laws across Europe. Unions were seen by the European political mainstream in the past as being a completely legitimate part of the European Union structure. And when the European Union was developed, they also developed alongside it what's called the European Trade Union Confederation, which is the European version, if you like, of the ITUC in Europe, and they created a whole number of European industrial committees, which were the sort of similar parallel to the global union federations, except that they were by and large funded through the European Commission, through the government. And they have a very different feel, different atmosphere to the rest of the world. Now, why is that important? If you're in Asia, Africa, Latin America, why does this mean anything? Because, whether we like it or not, the European trade union movement is still the strongest in the world, numerically, financially, and so on. And it's politically the most influential. So, if you go to any of the global union federations or the ITUC itself, the debate is dominated still by European trade union representatives. It's shifting, right? It's shifting a little bit. For example, in the Building and Woodworkers International, for the first time, a General Secretary was elected from the Global South, a Filipino, right? But that's very rare. In fact, I think it's still the only one. Is that right? Yes. Most of the General Secretaries and the senior staff of all these organisations are Europeans. And largely because the money that supports these organisations is largely from the Europeans, because they got the most money. So what happens in Europe is important, because it affects all of us, all over the world. And there's a strong relationship between unions, the European structures, and the European Commission, and the role of European Commission money is very strong. Now, you might argue that there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. If you've got governments which are supportive of the trade union movement, and that the unions have power within those structures, what's wrong with that? Well, two things. One is that the political complexion of Europe has changed. It is no longer dominated by a social democratic, vaguely pro-Labour agenda. It is now dominated by right-wing governments who have no interest in trade unionism whatsoever. Right? Secondly, that the whole shift, especially post the banking crisis and the emergence of financialisation and so on and so forth, that the idea of a social Europe has become a minority interest, let's put it that way, amongst governments and employers. And the relationship between the unions and the Commission is such that if you go to, and this is my personal view, others may disagree with it, but the climate, the political climate within the European trade union institutions tends to be very inward-looking. It looks to Brussels all the time. It looks to the European Union and the European Commission and all its committee structures and so on. It doesn't really relate to the rest of the world as I think it should. More importantly, it doesn't really play that organising function. It represents workers, right, to the European Union and European institutions, but it doesn't organise them, not like the global union federations attempt to do. It doesn't actually have organising campaigns across Europe, or very few. I don't know many examples. Do anybody else? So, there's a real problem with Europe, and it's getting worse. And I think, personally, and I think other people may agree, it's time to reform the European trade union organisations. Debate. Oh, sorry, how did that break out? Does that help? Oh, yeah. Good. Second, we're going to hear a lot more about this during the week, so I won't say very much. Is Sean in the room? Yes, Sean Sweeney at the back will be talking about this and other people later this week. But there's a crucial, one of the biggest problems facing us as human beings on this planet is climate change, energy, and so on, environment questions in general. But it remains a very marginal issue inside the trade union movement, and there are still a lot of arguments to be had internally in the international trade union movement about taking climate change seriously. We'll talk about that at length. Another problem is the trade union movement anti-capitalist. Are we against capitalism? Khalid says yes. Others might disagree. And you have a growing, it seems to me, movement of particularly young people around the world who are overtly anti-capitalist. They are looking for an alternative to global capitalism as a way of solving the problems that we have on the planet. And how does the trade union movement react to that? How do we think about that? Are we anti-capitalist? And I think it's a question which very few people dare to ask inside the trade union movement. Because if you're not anti-capitalist, or you are anti-capitalist, that leads you to very different directions in terms of strategy. What do you do? What is your politics? Crucial question, future of public services. We all know about privatisation. We're all against, I assume, privatisation. But the truth is that in many countries around the world, there has been privatisation, and there has been the decimation of what we understand as public services. So what do we want to do with this problem? Are we simply arguing, take it back under state control? Everything should be by the government for the people. Or are there alternatives? Are there other ways we should be thinking about public services, which are not simply run by the state for the people? The rise of precarious work. I mentioned that under financialisation. This is perhaps, for some unions, many unions, the highest priority of all. How do you fight things like agency labour, part-time work, all those different forms of precarious work and informal work, which we're going to come on to. And how do we organise informal workers? Informal workers are still, I think, today, the largest group of workers in the world. There are more informal workers trying to make a living somehow around the world than there are those that are formally employed. So how do we represent them? Does the trade union movement try to organise them? If so, how does it do it? We've got a whole session on that coming up later in the week, where we'll hear different experiences of people organising amongst the informal economy workers. Then how do we rebuild unions? For a lot of countries, unions have been in decline. Not all, but some, or a lot of countries have been in decline. They are less than popular. They are seen maybe by young people to be irrelevant. They are maybe by some people seen as being bureaucracies, controlled by politicians, there for the career advancement of the General Secretary. We all know these things, huh? The criticism. So how do we rebuild unions? How do we make unions which are really relevant and built from the bottom up by workers themselves? Either inside unions that we already have, or new unions. And there's lots of examples, which I've scattered about on there, of unions rebuilding from below. And you're going to be hearing a lot, especially tomorrow, when we talk about organising and our exchanging our experience about organising locally in our unions. And we'll hear a lot about different ways in which people are attempting to rebuild the unions from below. How many unions here are larger in membership than they were 5 years ago? RMT is.
Yes, the only ones.
No, there's others. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. RMT has. You're bigger than you were. 10. So those people who say that all unions are in decline, right, and all unions are facing catastrophe, and that we're dinosaurs, not true. 10 unions here that are bigger today than they were 10 years ago. So we want to hear about those experiences and how we do that. Okay. Then, how are we getting on for time? Getting on late. And I apologise for talking so long. The international organising agenda. How do we organise internationally, particularly in transnational corporations? And very briefly, there's a bit of a history that stretches back to the 1970s of trade unionists thinking through how do we organise workers effectively within the same transnational companies. And there's been lots of different initiatives taken over the years, and now you're talking about global union federations are talking about having global organising strategies where they put resources into prioritised industries, prioritised companies, and attempt to really build unions at a global level within a particular corporation or within a particular supply chain. So there's a lot of discussion now about how do we really organise internationally, not just meet each other once a year and have a chat, right? But how do we really make them into unions which are transnational in nature? Finally, is that finally? I think so. Yes, it is actually. Where are the politics? What do we stand for as the international trade union movement? Across the world, there is a crisis in social democracy. And I think Greece is by far the most vivid example. But not just in Greece. Countries all over the world, there is an absolute crisis in social democracy. And many of the traditional political partners of the trade union movement, there is growing tension between them and the trade unions themselves. So in Britain, there is a growing tension between the unions and the Labour Party. In Germany, there is growing tension between the unions and the Social Democratic Party. In Spain, there's a growing tension between the unions and the Socialist Party, and so on. I mean, I think in South Africa, in Brazil, in, I don't know, most of our countries, there is a growing gap between union politics and party politics as traditionally representing union concerns. And I think that that is because the way in which neoliberalism and austerity have actually become commonplace as policy right through these social democratic parties. They accept basic neoliberal politics, and of course they are inherently anti-worker. They are inherently anti-union. So of course there's going to be a growing tension between the party and the union. If that's true, then we have to start thinking about what is our politics. What do unions themselves stand for politically? Locally, nationally, and internationally. And it's very interesting to see that, for example, the IUF, for the first time, I believe, of any global union at any time, in its last Congress, actually had a debate about politics. Like never before. To begin a discussion which said, what are our politics? What do we stand for? We know what we're against, but what do we stand for? And it's interesting that, I think, the leadership of the Public Services International, the International Transport Workers, the International Union of Food Workers, and the Building and Woodworkers, the reason they support this summer school, partly, the leadership supports this because they want to have that debate within the international trade union movement. What do we stand for? What's our politics? And I believe that the resurgence of the WFTU, I don't think it's that strong, but it is an indication of unions becoming frustrated at the lack of political leadership at an international level by the trade union movement. And basically, do we have a democratic socialist alternative? What do we mean by that? Okay, I'm going to finish. Sorry, yes.
I just wanted to say I would wish that there be a more detailed explanation at some point of social democracy, neoliberalism, and democratic socialism.
Yes, right. Good question. That's why later on this week we're having a debate about where's the programme? Show me a programme, somebody. Come on, what we called the session. On Thursday, Yeah, Thursday. We're talking about the political agenda of the trade union movement, and we're asking, do we speak the same political language? What do we mean by socialism? What do we mean by feminism? What do we mean by syndicalism? What do these words mean? Because we know that they mean different things for different people in different countries, because of their histories, because of the political situation, the context they're in. These are words and terms which are, we need to begin to understand each other about what we understand by these terms. Yes?
Let me do it even worse, the bleak picture. What I see in Sweden is there is a gap between the leadership of the unions and the shop stewards,
right,
the members. And that is growing, especially in some bigger unions. And that makes it even worse, really.
It does.
Because these members and shop stewards don't trust the Social Democratic Party anymore, because it has lost its confidence among a majority of workers. But what they do now, when we go to vote, they vote for the fascist party.
Yes.
And that is very, very striking, really,
yes,
because the Social Democratic Party and the leadership of the unions are too closely linked together, and they are don't present any alternative, because they want to be in the middle all the time.
Very good. Say that again on Thursday. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about.
Every day if you want.
Okay. I'm going to finish by quoting from Sharon Burrow, who is the General Secretary of the ITUC. Now, just to put this in context before I read this out to you, the ITUC is not a radical organisation. By trade union standards, it's fairly conservative in general terms, and its history is fairly, within labour movement terms, conservative. Yet, she said a couple of years ago, she said, we are not only losing collective bargaining rights, we are now in a labour war, effectively across Europe, the US, and emerging democracies. Why? Because the old stakeholders who drove the neoliberal economic policies, those foul policies, the Washington consensus, if you like, are back in control. We thought the global financial crisis showed them that this was a failed economic model. We were wrong. We have now a situation where we are largely engaged in what I can only describe as a labour war. Now that's the head of the ITUC. So if she is saying that, there is something seriously wrong with what's going on, and our need to develop a political alternative. Okay. That's probably enough. Yes, sorry, Vishnu.
So, what is the relation between GUF and ITUC?
Yes. The relationship between the Global Union Federations and the ITUC, they are independent of one another. Okay, so each Global Union Federation is completely independent, answerable only to its unions that are affiliated to it through their congresses and so on and so forth. However, to a lesser or larger extent, depending on their political orientation, the Global Union Federations tend to group themselves with the ITUC. And they do see themselves as being part of the same political family, but to a greater or lesser extent. Some global unions are more critical, some are more close to the ITUC. That is in marked contrast to the WFTU and its equivalent of the Global Union Federations, known as Trade Union Internationals, TUIs, who are completely controlled by the WFTU. They are simply departments of the WFTU. And there are, from time to time, discussions and arguments within the ITUC and the Global Union Federations, basically to bring the Global Union Federations within the ITUC framework. But that's resisted normally by the Global Union Federations who fight for their independence. Would you agree, Hazel? Yes.
We are asking about NSTR, Global Union Federation, which is used the name and their logo, Global Union Federation.
Yeah.
NSTR Global. This is the second biggest international federation after ITUC. What are you thinking about NSTR?
LSTR. Oh, Industrial. Right. No, Industrial, sorry, thank you. Industrial is a global union federation. So back to the original. Yeah. So these are the global union federations, right? And Industrial is one of the biggest, but it's still a sectoral federation. So it's not a challenge to the ITUC. Okay, I'm sorry to have spoken so long, and I hope that's done more to help rather than hinder, and done more to clarify rather than confuse. Grab me or other people anybody who looks older than me probably knows more than I do, so ask them for any questions as well as me. Any final questions?
Is ACFTU, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, part of any of these organizations?
No, not. However, as at some point we will be discussing China, and there is a complicated relationship. For those who don't know, in China, it's a very big issue. In China, the only trade unions officially recognised is what's called the All China Federation of Trade Unions. Although it's not a member of the WFTU and never has been, it is absolutely run by the Chinese Communist Party, and the policies are formulated and so on and so forth by the party. And if you attempt to form a union in China independently of that, you would be arrested. In the past, we'll hear more about this, but in the past, not just arrested, you'd be put into a lunatic asylum, right? Or you'd be put into jail, or you'd be severely punished. But things are cracking within the ACFTU. How much it's cracking is a question for debate. We'll be very interested to hear. But at the moment, the ACFTU is not part of any of these structures, although most of the global union federations and the ITUC are actively engaged in dialogue with the ACFTU. There is discussion going on all the time. And they are now represented, I think this is a mistake, but they are represented now on the governing body of the ILO. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Right, good. Thank you so much for coming. And